the executive director of Warehouse Workers for Justice in Chicago in the United States.
So what would be your hope then for post-ILC mobilization?
Well, I think one of the main things that has to happen is we need more campaigns that are explicit supply chain campaigns. And so campaigns targeting a brand that involve that link workers not only in producing countries but also in buying countries. We represent workers who distribute all of these manufactured products, mostly manufactured in Asia. We really think if you could develop something where you've got workers in the buying countries in the global north working in solidarity with workers in the global south, that adds an extra dimension to this work and ultimately is the kind of thing that we need to see if we're going to move the actors we need to move to win a binding convention.
And can you explain then to people who are less familiar with the issues why a binding convention would be so important?
Well, a binding convention, I mean, to step back, one of the main problems with the supply chain is lack of accountability. Everybody wants to do something voluntary. Everybody wants to have sort of a global set of standards, and that's all well and good. Companies should have those things. But where the rubber meets the road is really binding enforcement that ties the lead firm, that makes the lead firm legally accountable for violations throughout its supply chain from top to bottom. And so a binding ILO convention paves the way. It's one tool to help do that, because it would bind countries to implement legislation that would hold those lead firms accountable, ideally.
Businesses, of course, will often argue that that's actually the job of the host country. The host country should be protecting labour standards. What would your response be to that?
You know, the problem is that there's no right for a company inherently to just become as big as it possibly can. The reality is when companies become this large and supply chains become this dominant, you need to regulate them. That cannot be done on a nation-by-nation basis. You have nations that will, almost by necessity, end up competing to offer the lowest labor costs and the most favorable regulatory environment. Without some global structure to enforce real supply chain accountability, then there's really no way to imagine how you would effectively regulate supply chains.
And what would certain of the key components of this accountability be?
Well, for us, one of the big ones would be the freedom of association. We think collective bargaining is ultimately the best way to ensure that standards are enforced. You're never going to have enough money to pay enough government inspectors throughout the world to inspect every piece of every agreement. But if workers are trained to do those inspections themselves, to enforce those standards themselves, and have the protection of a union contract, then you will start to see those standards start to go up. So one key element is protection for freedom of association and some structure that allows for collective bargaining, not only with the direct employer, of course, but with that lead firm. Another one would be, legislation that links or a standard that supports legislation at the national level that would link the lead firm and to its supply chain in terms of legal accountability. Even if we can't come up with some global structure to do labor enforcement, what you can do is, for instance, in the United States, make, say, Walmart, for example, legally accountable for its factories in Bangladesh. That's kind of the bright line that we're trying to cross here.
Okay, so some form of extraterritorial power.
Right. It wouldn't necessarily be extraterritorial power, but if you want to operate in the United States, you have to operate by a certain set of global standards. You could choose not to operate in the United States if you wanted to. If you wanted to avoid those standards, you could go to a country that didn't have that type of liability. But I think ultimately that's what an effective ILO convention could help support.
And you mentioned the word effective and linked with ILO. What would an effective ILO role be in this going forward?
Certainly being a space where the various social actors can articulate the need for some regulation of supply chains and lifting that up on a global level. Putting forward a set of standards that, even in a country like the United States that doesn't ratify many ILO conventions, could still be a model for large global employers that are based in the United States that need to worry about their image in Europe or in Asia or in other parts of the world. So, and then continuing to do the research necessary, although we would argue that the research is really done, and the reality is, the case has been made that there are real labor issues in these supply chains, and so really the ILO needs to act. That's what we're looking for.
Okay, so this of course contrasts a lot with what the employers groups are saying. We need more research and we need to kick the action down the road. How would you respond to that?
Well, employers always say that. I've been a union negotiator for 20 years. That's usually what we hear from employers. That's not surprising. The reality is employers have all kinds of different codes of conduct that they use to govern their supply chain. Employers manage their supply chain with such specificity. In fact, big retailers compete on the basis of how effective and efficient their supply chains are. To say that an employer, a large manufacturer or retailer, doesn't have the ability right now to affect these changes in its supply chain, it is impossible if you look at the way supply chains operate.
So we're talking willingness, not ability.
Exactly. So there's nothing further that needs to happen before there's action taken.